Hello and welcome to In the Center, produced by All Survivors Project. This podcast aims to deepen and broaden dialogue by addressing conflict-related sexual violence affecting men, boys, and LGBTI+ people. We bring together victims and survivors, researchers and policymakers from around the globe to talk about their work and experiences, and to explore key themes around prevention, care, and support for survivors through national and international level responses. My name is Charu Hogg, and I'm one of your hosts with my colleagues from All Survivors Project. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to this episode of In the Center. My name is Jelia Sane and I am the Senior Legal and Policy Advisor at All Survivors Project. In today's episode, we will be diving into the issue of criminal justice and accountability for male victims of wartime sexual violence. The evidence is mounting that men and boys are subject to sexual violence in a number of conflict situations around the world, including rape, genital mutilation, forced perpetration and forced witnessing of sexual violence, as well as forced marriage and sexual slavery, particularly in the case of boys associated with armed groups. However, this is an issue that continues to be underreported, underdocumented, and underinvestigated, both domestically and internationally, thereby preventing victims and survivors from having access to the assistance and the remedies to which they are entitled. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the challenges around securing justice for men and boys affected by wartime sexual violence. And I'm joined by two eminent practitioners in the field. It's my honor to welcome firstly, Mrs. Patricia Viseur Sellers. Patricia is a world-renowned expert in the field of international criminal law and gender justice, and currently serves as the Special Advisor on Slavery Crimes to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Prior to this, she was for 5 years the Special Advisor on Gender to the former Prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda. Patricia has extensive experience of working as a prosecutor and legal advisor on gender at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And before the ad hoc tribunals, she was instrumental in developing legal strategies that led to groundbreaking jurisprudence regarding sexual violence as a war crime, as a crime against humanity, as a constitutive of torture, genocide, and enslavement, including in the case of Akayesu, which was the first prosecution at the ICTR. Welcome to the podcast, Patricia. I'm also delighted to welcome Fadel Abdul Ghany, the founder and director of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. The Syrian Network for Human Rights is an independent human rights organization created in June 2011 that monitors and documents conflict-related violations in Syria. The Syrian Network shares its data with a number of key international bodies, including the UN Office of the High Commission of Human Rights, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria, the IIIN. The Syrian Network also supports advocacy efforts for victims of human rights violations in Syria and works on advancing transitional justice, democratic change, and lasting peace in the country. Warm welcome, Fadel. Thank you for joining us. So I'd like to begin by asking you about some of the patterns and drivers of male-directed sexual violence in the context in which you have worked. Beginning with you, Patricia, what can you share with us about sexual violence against men and boys in the context of the armed conflict in the Balkans?
Well, that's a very good question because from the work of the Yugoslav Tribunal, what was revealed is that there were 5 patterns around the male sexual violence. The first pattern, I have to say, is situational, and that is that most of the male sexual violence occurred in detention camps. Not always, but I would say almost 90% of the time period. The other patterns that we detected within these detention camps is that male sexual violence often was sexual violence that was public. And I'm saying public in the sense that the violence was done in front of other people and usually other male detainees. And so you would have a perpetrator who would have a male detainee perform a sexual act on another male detainee, or that detainee themselves would be abused. And it was public in front of other detainees, probably because it was as much as the humiliation, the physical humiliation of one detainee or set of detainees, and the psychological terrorization of the detainees who had to look. Another pattern that came out is that often the sexual violence involved two people, two male detainees. And at times it would be the two males would be related, brother and brother, father and son, or let's say they were from the same military unit or the same village. And the relationship between the two detainees who were forced to abuse each other increased the humiliation, the harm, the terrorization, the feelings of utter hopelessness and guilt. And then I would say a last pattern that came up within the Yugoslav situation is that normally the perpetrator did not physically partake in the sexual violence, but directed the sexual violence being committed against others. There were just very few instances where the perpetrator also was a physical participant in the sexual violence. And this differs very much from the sexual violence that could be committed against women or girls. So those were the in very general terms, the Balkan patterns of male sexual violence related to the armed conflict.
I think that certainly tallies with some of the instances and patterns that we've documented as well, particularly in the detention context, and that really being a site of particular vulnerability for a lot of men and boys. Fadel, if I could turn to you and ask about some of the patterns that your organization has documented in Syria.
There is also, in Syria, there is two patterns. The first one, we noticed when Assad regime was controlled almost the whole Syria, Assad, beside the thugs, we called in the local word, Shabiha, those are thugs, and mainly they committed a lot of sexual harassment and sexual violence against male in Syria, especially when they are at the beginning of the uprising. Assad was controlling like almost all the neighborhoods, so they're used to committed invading against specific neighborhood to arrest people there and to committed also we called sectarian massacres, so massacres holding sectarian touch. We recognize that based on several factors, mainly who's committed those and their speech. In those massacres, which those are not a few in the Syria context, we documented above than 50 massacres. Most of them took place in Homs province. We noticed that there is like a type of sexual violence against male committed in those massacres. But mainly the heavy pattern or the systematic way being done in the center detention. We know very well that in Syria, a tremendous amount of the population being held in the center detention. Past now more than 10 years. So 10 and a half years. What's still in the center detention, like first of all, our estimation who's like been in those center detention, 1.2 millions. That's a very huge figures. Like, and among of those, the percentage of the male, about 78%, 88%. So the vast majorities are male. From this percentage, approximately also we can say that 60% from the male like treated one or more from sexual harassment, one way or others. Till now, there is 149,000 Syrian in center detention, mainly also the vast majority of them in Assad center detention. We are talking about 87% from those, and other parties also like HYD, the Kurd militia, the opposition forces, this extremist group like Hayat Tahrir Sham and ISIS. ISIS still no longer exists, but there is those who's disappeared. Thousands of Syrians, their fate still disappeared. So those figures subjected to lots of sexual harassment in the Assad center detention, and also I can say that some of those sexual harassment also holding a sectarian angle.
So sexual violence in the context of arrests, massacres, disappearances, and detention, and potentially a staggering number of victims and survivors. If I could zoom out a little bit from those contexts and ask you, Patricia, to set out for us how notions of gender come into play when we talk about this. So you served for many years as a legal advisor on gender in the tribunals. And I'd like to ask you, I suppose, firstly, why do we need legal advisors on gender? What does it mean to have a gender strategy and to adopt a gendered analysis to international crimes? And secondly, if we focus on crimes of sexual violence and leave aside other gender-based crimes, in what ways is sexual violence against men and boys a gendered crime, in your view?
Right. Well, I think that the importance of having legal advisors, but in addition, attorneys, investigators, analysts who understand the gendered nature of armed conflicts, the gendered nature of crimes against humanity or genocide is fundamental to understanding the breadth of the criminality that has occurred and how it has been driven and against whom it has occurred and how it impacts from a gender perspective. But let me just go back to the notions of gender without repeating what now seems to be quite the standard bearer, that of, yes, we're talking about females, we're talking about males. That's why sometimes I just do shorthand males and females, but it means boys, it means older women, it means premenopausal, postmenopausal women, it means military age fighting males, but it also means people on gender spectrum. It could be persons who are non-binary, LGBTIQ. And then the other thing I would emphasize is one of the reasons that it is very important to understand the different gender configuration of survivors and victims is that the perpetrator is using their own perspective on gender to inflict harms. And so for us, from a position of investigation, prosecution, adjudication, or from documenting human rights violations, if we don't understand that the perpetrator themselves have a gender perception, if not ideology, of how they will wage an armed conflict or how they will wage persecution or genocide, then we're missing absolutely the breadth of the international harm of the atrocities. Let me also just zero in and say that we have to understand that each human being has a sexual integrity and a sexual autonomy. We often don't understand this concretely until your sexual autonomy or integrity has been attacked, and whether it's via sexual humiliation, whether it's via a physical violation or the combination of the two. What I've often had survivor victims explain is that you don't understand the depth of how you are attached to your sexual identity, autonomy, and integrity. On a very light note, we know how very easy it is for junior high school children to tease each other about their perceived sexuality, whether they look girlish enough, boyish enough, about who are you going out with, how big are certain parts of your body. And that's a very surfacey way that they're going after something that seems to be immaterial, but that is very much a psychological and physical part of ourselves. And so it is little wonder that when armed conflict arises or crimes against humanity, that this becomes a ubiquitous part of the violations, because each person has this integrity and autonomy, the sexualized integrity and autonomy, that can be targeted and attacked, and that can destroy the person and that person's relationship to their community and to their society. We're all vulnerable in that very place. And I think that probably during non-armed conflict times, I think women might think about that in the very, and I'll use quite a US cliche, of walking through the underground parking lot at night. Just the fact of putting your keys in your fingers means that you're thinking about your sexual integrity, okay? I think that most men are not conscious of it during non-armed conflict situations unless they feel that they might go to prison, where the frequency of male sexual violence is higher. So it is there. It is always present. And then it becomes heightened and it becomes instrumentalized when we get into situations of armed conflict, genocide, or crimes against humanity.
And so if we look at sexual violence against men and boys, so how would we adopt a gendered approach to those crimes in terms of, I think it was interesting that you mentioned, for instance, in the ICTY context, the fact that a lot of the cases that you saw, the acts were perpetrated publicly, for instance, and it was family members being forced to perpetrate these acts on one another. What does that communicate, and what does that have to do with the victims' identities as men and as boys?
Well, it shows, first of all, that the victim, be it an individual, person, a biological person, that victim has a relational sense, related to the group of, let's say, men with which they were fighting, related to the community in which they live, related to their race, their religion, their ethnicity, is that we're all combinations of, we're all components of different identities and different social and cultural contexts, in addition to being an individual. That might be one of the greatest kind of psychological tugs that we have throughout life. I belong, or don't I belong? I'm an individual, or am I part of a group? And of course, that gender and sexuality get played around that very dynamic. In terms of, for example, documenting sexual violence against boys, I'm sure Fadel could answer this, but it also depends on the situation. It depends on the situation of Colombia, might be very different from Syria. The Balkans are very different. But because of the under-investigation, it's very difficult to conceive of a complete answer to that question. We don't exactly know the difference in terms of boy sexual abuse, psychological or physical, compared to what? To girls, or to grown men, or to grown women. We're still at the very beginning of even collecting data or statistics in terms of armed conflict.
Absolutely. And I mean, certainly something that we come across in our work in many countries is dispelling a lot of these notions around, male invulnerability to sexual violence. That's really a challenge that we have, and how also those myths manifest in humanitarian responses, in justice processes, in how the response is shaped. I think there's still, in a lot of places in which we work, quite a lot of resistance around the recognition that this even happens. And presumably that's also something that you're faced with in Syria, no, Fadel, when it comes to trying to document these cases, gather testimony. Self-identification is a huge barrier. I mean, in general, but I would say that we see it a lot with male victims. Are those some issues that you're also coming across as documenters, trying to gather some of this information?
Yeah, we do. This is like all of those points you mentioned that are the challenging for us. And in the Syria context, I can add one thing that the male which we are talking with, they don't know that what is subjected to be a sexual harassment. They don't know that. They don't know their right, their protection. This behavior and that we revealed, and that very surprised, very shocked, and that showing how much like effort we need to spend in order to raise the awareness of in between the society. Like we revealed that while we are talking from a normal sort of survival. In his testimony, we said they used to do this for us. Stop. This is a sexual harassment. Then he denied after that because he don't want to admit this. That's so difficult. Sometimes we are unable to include that because he like pull his word.
Patricia, do you see some of these challenges at play also at the international level? I mean, we know that there is now a fairly extensive body of international jurisprudence that has recognized and highlighted the different forms of wartime sexual violence against women and girls, in large part thanks to your efforts, I should say. But if we look at, the practice of, if I take the ICTY and the ICC, for example, in your view, are these mechanisms that have strategies in place for collecting information and evidence for prosecution of wartime sexual violence against men and boys?
Well, I think that what Fadel is saying is very frustrating, where males will often suddenly understand a bit more about their own sexual abuse and then try to shut it down and deny it. I think that is quite common. And among the reasons, I believe, and more so some reading and anecdotal evidence on it, is that, as I stated before, males do not conceive in their head that they will be the object of sexual violence. Women around the world conceive of that on an everyday basis. We're brought up in society to protect yourself all the time. And men do not have that consciousness that they might be attacked. Maybe they'll have to beat someone up, or maybe they'll have to run fast. But to protect themselves from sexual violence isn't an everyday thought. And so that when someone is documenting like Fadel, and the person is describing what happened, and you're reiterating what happened, but using different language to say, oh, you've been sexually assaulted, that brings a thought in their head that they're not only not comfortable with, have not really conceived of. Or if they do know that on some level that they have been attacked with their genitalia, or that they have somehow suffered what they might call just disgrace, but they haven't yet put words to it, they will want to suppress it. What we have found in general, that it is often much more difficult for males to come forward than it is for females because of this really disconnect. And then there's something else that's going on. During times of armed conflict, masculinity takes on other hierarchy, where the fighter and the victorious general kind of go up the hierarchy scale. And lower down on that masculine scale is the captive male, is the male who is held down by other males and made vulnerable by other males. And this too can act toward the denial and the shutting down. And it's quite interesting how males who are captured or in detention, that the perpetrator male knows exactly where to go in order to abuse and humiliate, which has its own kind of internal silencing, knowing that that victim will be more silent than before. One of the myths that I think has come out within Syria, and we saw it in the Balkans is that before we'd always think, well, the sexual violence was related to the interrogation session. And we're finding that's not necessarily because they were trying to get information from that person. That could coincide with it. But they're trying to control a population. And that's where some of the sexual abuse comes out. Right now in the former Yugoslavia, you have men who are 25 years post-armed conflict who are coming to terms with the fact that they've been sexually abused and are coming forward a bit more readily. It's been the time to digest, the time to make themselves whole again, the time where possibly their spouses are no longer alive or their children are grown up, or they're understanding that this topic can be placed on top of the table and not be something that is the unsaid, the known but the unsaid. You know, I'm trying to avoid words like shame and stigma as they relate to males or to females, because the silencing is in many ways what the state does. So I very much feel in terms of documentation that the really egregious difficulty is almost a norm. When we just look at, let's say, male sexual violence with the Catholic Church or with the Boy Scouts of the United States, these men have waited 20 years to come forward. You know, not just because they were children and grew into it, but because male sexual violence often, similar to some female sexual violence, but with its own patterns, takes years, if not decades, to finally, I don't want to say digest, but to reconcile.
What about when victims do come forward? What are some of the barriers that exist within the current responses? Do you think that investigative strategies, evidence collection strategies, are they alive to this issue? Or does it remain sort of a blind spot the same way that it was perhaps with the women and girls 20 or 30 years ago?
Well, I would say that it's not as developed as it should be, but it is developing. For example, when you have a situation that could be in Uganda, that you start to identifying the patterns of where and how males might be sexually abused. They might be sexually abused, as I said, during periods of detention, during periods of interrogation, that it was obvious in one of the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo cases, that just the taking over of towns and going house to house, that you would find sexual humiliation of the parents, male parents and female parents. And so it was very important to understand, okay, when the house was being taken over, that you don't stop when you say, okay, and what did they do to the wife? And you listen to that and you say, well, was the man present? And the person would say yes or no. You need to continue asking, okay, and did the male see his wife being sexually violated? Okay, and they said, yes, it was horrible. But to understand that that male witnessing that sexual violence means that that male was psychologically, sexually tortured also. You know, to see someone who you have an affiliation with sexually violated is a sexual violation for you. But then to continue to ask, and then what, if anything, did happen to the male? Was that male allowed to stand next to the person? Did they have to remain with the same clothing? So that you finally develop a manner to ask the appropriate questions that gets to the male sexual violence in a way that contextualizes it with the rest of the criminal harm. And that, to a certain extent, is helpful because then the male sexual violence is not an outlier. It's not something that happened extraordinarily. It happened, and they can see as a result of this political takeover that was militarized.
Do you think it seems like there has been progress, right? When one looks at perhaps some of the earlier charging decisions, ICTY, for instance, there seems to perhaps be less of a risk of, because one thing that we've seen in many contexts is these types of crimes being exclusively characterized as torture, right? And so the sexual nature of it is rendered invisible, and also the sexualized harm. Do you think there's still a risk of that, or have the institutions evolved enough to be able to really recognize it when they see it, if they know to look for it in the fact it's a continuum, right? So the investigators need to know to ask the questions, but then when it gets in front of a judge, then it needs to be charged correctly. But then also upheld,
Right. And then your submissions have to be adequate. I would say that some of the jurisprudence of the ICTY that relates to male sexual violence is surprisingly rich and surprisingly overlooked by much of the international legal community. There is almost this notion that we still have to have a case or two. We do. We have to have many cases. But one thing that the jurisprudence at the Yugoslav Tribunal has brought forward is that we have seen male sexual violence in the context, like you've mentioned, of torture, but of physical and of psychological torture. We've seen male sexual violence be part of the evidence of persecution as part of a crime against humanity. We've seen male sexual violence include charges of rape when men were forced to fellatio each other or forced to have anal intercourse with each other. We've seen male sexual violence be part of the evidentiary basis for convictions of heads of state and parts of the convictions when a head of state pleaded guilty, that plea included male sexual violence. And some of this has been far too overlooked. The first sexual violence case at the Yugoslav Tribunal that successfully charged up until the appellate level male sexual violence under command responsibility was held. So we know that commanders can be responsible for sexual violence that their subordinates committed under normal command responsibility philosophies. And then just quickly to go back to your question of torture, I know it seems to be trending a bit to say, well, we've placed it under torture and therefore we've disguised the sexual violence. And it's very true that in the beginning, it was important to understand that men might tend to say that I've been tortured rather than I've been sexually violated or raped, because torture is a more masculine category under which to place harms. But I don't think that we should therefore not avail men of the legal rubric or crime of torture. I think we have to understand that some torture is sexualized torture, but it means that men can be sexually tortured, they can be raped, they can come under persecution as a basis of sexualized persecution or sexualized cruel treatment. So what I would prefer is that men have the availability of all the legal provisions that they need to for sexual abuses that might have occurred to them, and not say, no, if you don't put it under an explicitly sexual one like rape, then that's not progress. I don't think that's true.
And of course, rape is recognized as a form of torture as well, so we shouldn't lose sight of that. Looking a little bit towards the future, especially vis-a-vis Syria and accountability for crimes perpetrated in that context, the options for accountability are fairly limited, currently, but there is the International Independent and Impartial Mechanism, the IIIM, which we know is currently working to gather and preserve evidence for future prosecutions. So Fadel, I know that your organization collaborates with them, shares information with them. Do you have a sense as to whether or not this issue of sexual violence against men and boys in Syria is something that's on their radar?
First of all, about the accountability in Syria in general, I think that, as you mentioned also, there's very few chance till now to held accountable who committed those intensive crimes against humanity due the weakness of the mechanism, even the establishment of the IIIM, and they are building files in order to submit to the national court to use the universal jurisdiction. That's very limited also, and the crimes against humanity still continuing in Syria. So I think that even the IIIM or the Commission of Inquiry or even us, we are dealing with documentation standard, and we need a concrete evidence or testimonies. So we rely mainly of this willingness of the victims to talk, to testify what they subjected to, and then we match from many survival at the same security branches, and then we get to the if we don't have that prevent us to include such, like I can say, a deep, a profound crimes in Syria. Maybe our also criteria and methodology is like less than the international criminal law methodology and criteria, which they required far more evidence than what we have to be included. So I think that it's I'm not seeing any hope to include the sexual harassment against male, and that lead to more effort on our shoulder. But like there is a few hope that sexual violence being included in the Koblenz trial in Germany as a crimes committed in Al-Khatib branch, and that condemned the Al Assad regime, because this, like even Anwar Raslan, the perpetrator, who's like been arrested in Germany, he is not represent himself as a person. He represent the system. This is system. So there is this successful, I can say, that this crimes being accepted by the prosecutor, and that like give us a little bit hope in order to continue. We are documenting like vast majorities of and types of violation, like including harassment against the children, women, barrel bombs, chemical weapons, detention, disappearance, shilling against hospitals, vital facilities, different types of displacement. From here, I can declare that documentation, the sexual harassment and violence against male is the most difficult ever one we faced.
Yeah, and I think it's a vicious cycle as well, because part of the reason why, other than the reasons that we've discussed, that we're also seeing a lot of barriers to self-identification and to disclosure is because there's a perception, which is often borne out objectively, that the response is going to be inadequate, right? So be it the humanitarian response, the medical response, and also the response from justice actors, who often lack the knowledge, the skills, the training to be able to properly take charge of these cases. And until they see more cases, they're not really going to see a need to strengthen their response. But until they do that, the cases are going to stay silent, right? So then it becomes this vicious cycle that's quite difficult to break. Could I ask you, Patricia, and I'll end with this, are there any lessons that we can learn from the advances that have been made when it comes to documenting and investigating sexual violence against women and girls that can be applied to men and boys?
Yes, I think that there are. And I think that I would say there are at least three things to learn. First of all, we have to make sure that our assumption is that the sexual violence is very much a part of the overall pattern. And for the investigator, not to eliminate it per se, because I think it will be hard. I think Fadel is absolutely right. It is an arduous task. But if the investigator or the documenter eliminates it because they say this is going to be too hard, then it disappears. It completely disappears. And you've actually deformed the context of the armed conflict or the context of that situation of the atrocity. So that's the one thing we learned in the Balkans, and I would add in other situations, is that when we went into a detention center and we knew that they were holding males and females, and we often knew that males and females, the first things they did was separate them, then the red flag should go up. We should be seeing, is there, in the very least, forced nudity, sexual humiliation? One of the most common forms of male sexual violence that we encountered is just that when men are beaten, they are often kicked on their genitals, and that's why you see men roll up in kind of like what do you call that? The form, the fetal form, because they're the fetal position, because they're protecting their genitalia. And just to recognize that, what you're seeing, so that the investigator doesn't say, oh, did they beat you on your back, your head, and then leave it, to understand that. So that's one lesson learned. The other lesson learned is that from the perpetrator's point of view, this is an absolutely exquisite form of damage to inflict. And so that one should be thinking often from the perpetrator's point of view. What is it that they're doing? How do they want this population to be seen, felt, remembered? What do they call victory from the perpetrator's point of view? So that's a second lesson learned. And then I would think that the third lesson learned, in particularly with male sexual violence, even though I've said it's public compared to female sexual violence, that there's a bond between those victims/survivors and the public who's looking at. So in many ways, the male public that is being forced to watch, that themselves are a victim of psychological sexual violence, often do not want to talk about what they've seen because they believe that they're breaking really the respect and privacy of the survivors, which makes it very difficult to talk to the public that sees it in addition to the survivors. Whereas with female sexual violence, we've tended to find that when females are violated, at the same time in a detention center, they're often taken to separate rooms, or their violation might occur physically separate from other females. But those females can bond together in a different way. And they can all decide, okay, we're all going to talk about it at the same time and present this very strong, united voice of the contextualization of how the sexual violence occurred. We don't necessarily see that pattern emerging with men. And then that makes it very hard. And then I'll quickly say on the last thing is that we're still, I think, being absolutely blind to a lot of sexual violence. I mean, when we look at boy soldiers who are told to rape, or they willingly, in quotes, rape so that they can move up the masculine hierarchy as these boy soldiers whose parent figures, these males, are men who do rape and eventually will reward them with a woman who will, in quotes, be the misnomer of their wife so they can continue rape. That's male sexual violence. That's boy sexual violence. That's boy sexual terrorism from the beginning. And in the Cambodia situation, when we're looking at forced marriages and the males that are, in quotes, forced to copulate in order to breed children for the Khmer Rouge, or to breed children, let's say, in the militia situations in Sierra Leone or Uganda, that's male sexual violence. And the longer we refuse to look at that and only emphasize the sexual violence as it pertains to the female, we're just not serving justice.
Thank you both so much for your time today. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. So thank you. Thank you both very much.
That brings us to the end of this episode of In the Center. Thank you very much for joining All Survivors Project. We would like to give a special thanks to our sound editor, Daniel Frankusen. If you found this discussion useful, please subscribe to and access all our monthly forthcoming episodes. We are also on Twitter, and you can check out our website, allsurvivorsproject.org. We would very much like to hear your thoughts and suggestions for future podcasts. All views are welcomed, so please stay in touch and see you next time.